terminology, what's criminal justice system, what are the basic kinds of facts about it that I want you guys to know. Well, criminal justice system you could call the system of formal social control. So to remind you guys what formal social control is versus informal social control. Informal social control is the stuff we do to police each other. It's like raised eyebrows, it's gossip, it's like all that kind of stuff. Formal social control is what's done by paid professionals of society that enforce its norms. Okay, so police officers, judges, prosecutors, all the people involved in that kind of thing. Now, what if you're interested in the levels of criminal deviance in a society at any given time? Do we have any knowledge about it beyond what we observe or experience in our everyday lives? And so the answer would be yeah, because we got statistics, people that gather it, and then it gets broadcast by the news. What are the statistics in the society we live in? Okay, the thing I want you to know is that the biggest collector and publicizer, publisher of information on that kind of stuff is the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It's existed. I can't remember when it started, if it was in the 1930s or earlier that it was founded, but it's been collecting data systematically ever since. Here's the kind of data you can get from the FBI on levels of criminality in your society to get an idea about how dangerous, what your risk is, and so on. Of course, this varies by geographic locale and age and all kinds of things. But by the way, I'm going to show you in just a little bit where you could go online to get this updated information from the FBI. Okay, so the FBI gathers particular kinds of data. Where does it get its data? From local enforcement agencies, from local sheriff's offices, police districts, and so on. They basically request that these agencies collect categories of crime that interest the FBI and send them in. Okay? One thing to keep in mind when you take a look at trends of crime over the decades is if you see changes, you should ask yourself, I wonder how much the changes that I'm seeing have to do with changes or improvement in data gathering methods, in ability to store, send data because of computers that didn't exist, say back, before the 1980s, for example. And there's a host of other issues you could ask too, to put in question the data that's being compiled and presented for you. I'm just going to leave the questions at that one alone. Here are the categories of crime that the FBI compiles. Crimes against persons, violent crimes. Your murder, your rape, your aggravated assault, your robberies, okay, theft where coercive force is used, and things of that sort. Then against property, so basically stealing stuff, property crimes, okay, burglary, larceny, theft, auto theft, arson as well, okay, so it collects those. It's also interested in victimless crimes. Well, I should say that victimless crimes is another category of crime we might consider. And when we use that term, this word here, misnomer, means something badly named. A misnomer is something where the name is misleading. So people say the following kinds of crimes, prostitution, drug use, and so on, they don't seem to fall in violent or property crime categories. But, okay, if you call them victimless crimes, the reason you do is because you're trying to say that the only person that's hurt, the only person victimized is the person perpetrating the crime, doing the thing. And you might say, that ain't right. Okay, there's other people that get harmed. If you do drugs and you're a parent, you're probably harming your kids, okay, in ways you may not even be aware of because you're doing the drugs, and so on, right? That other people might get hurt, there's collateral damage, therefore maybe that's a misnomer. Let's see, then, look, there's a section in your book. I want to point out one thing. I'm going to point to places in your textbook where I'm going to hold you guys responsible for the quiz this time around, and maybe partly for the very last quiz-like assessment we'll be doing. There may be questions that the answers to which I haven't given you in the lecture here, but which I'm going to let you guys track down yourself. But I haven't updated the pages on this PowerPoint to match the newer edition of the text. So, for instance, this section on the street criminal, let's see where this comes. In your textbook, it's not 208, it's another 60 pages. It's like 263. So if I were to change this here, this actually is 263 to 264, 263 to 264. Just be aware of that, okay? We're in chapter 10. Here are the statistics. So you could say, based on the kind of statistics that the FBI receives, so proportions of this or that kind of person in terms of age, ethnicity, and so on, that does particular kinds of crimes, to the extent that that becomes published and fairly widely known by the broader public, this may create an image in the mind of what the typical kind of criminal is. And here, there certainly is one of the kind of person who commits a violent crime. Okay, so what are the proportions that the FBI? By the way, okay, these age, gender, and race and ethnicity are the only things the FBI gathers systematic information about. So it's actually of interest to us to know that the FBI does not collect and publish data systematically on class, that is economic class, income, wealth, and so on. Well, that seems like a monstrous oversight on the, or should, or probably does to many on the part of, say, a criminologist or any in this issue. I was asking why would that be? But they do on age, gender, race, and ethnicity. And so here is the data that we get on violent crimes. What is the age? The peak age for committing violent crimes? Okay, the age cohort that commits the most by far and away is youngsters. But by that, I mean between the ages of like 8 and 25. Okay, they're committing the bulk of this stuff. Okay, gender. Who's committing most crimes? It's males by far and away. Okay, there has been a historical trend that's seen an uptick in the proportion of females committing these crimes, but it's still males. So let me just read some figures. For age, the 15 to 24-year-olds, they make up 14% of the population. So 14% of the population. So if everyone across all ages committed more or less the same amount of crime, right, you would expect it to be 14. They account for 33% of arrests for violent crime. So it's disproportionately high among that age group, right? Which begs all kinds of questions, right? These kinds of interesting or notable facts kind of ask for an explanation. What accounts for that? And you could ask like biological factors, cultural factors, and so on. Are there expectations about how you're going to behave at a certain age, or are there structural features, right? Maybe it's unemployment. You're sort of between living at home and, you know, having a full career. So it's kind of this in-between time during which your involvement, to use that, you know, control theory language, your involvement in kind of conventional activities may take a dive, depending on where you find yourself, maybe depending on social class. In any way, gender, deal with gender. Males commit 62% of property crimes, right? So about 2 times that of females. Females, you know, taking up, you know, the other third proportion. Violent crime, This was figures, I think, from like 2015. I think they're the ones you'll find in your textbook. 80% by males. So that'd be 4 times as many as females. Okay? And so you could immediately, your mind could gravitate spontaneously to some kind of biological explanation. Must have to do with, like, the nervous neural hormonal system of the males. Testosterone, being one of the primary culprits. Maybe that explains, why you have a system, an organism ready to, violate physically aggressively against other people. And then race, okay? So race, ethnicity, this won't come to any surprise to anybody who's lived in this society for any amount of time, that there are going to be certain race / quote unquote racial or ethnic groups who are disproportionately high, represented disproportionately highly, okay, in the class of violent crime offenders, and it's going to be minority groups. It's going to be those who identify themselves or are identified by others as Black or African American, Hispanic, and the like. Those are the 2 main categories historically. Now, it turns out that, and this is solely for reasons of overall proportions in the population, but whites account for 70% of all crimes, okay, property and violent crimes together, and that's pretty representative. That's more or less representative of the proportion of people identifying as white in the U.S. population. Okay? When it comes to violent crimes, you find that 36%, okay, of all violent crime arrests are accounted for by African Americans. Okay, 36%, so that's over a third. Does that reflect the overall proportion of African Americans in the population? No, it exceeds it by about 3 times. Okay, so 3 times greater than the kind of proportion that they represent in the population. So they're being over-arrested in terms of pure numbers. Does that mean they're being unfairly arrested? Okay, that is this a result of what in the media has been for a long time been called racial profiling, right? Where you see a person and by their characteristics, you sort of put them within a kind of race. Just kind of a side note, racial categories are not biologically well-founded, so they're not a good scientific category. There's all kinds of problems with it. Trying to account for real biological diversity in the human population. Nevertheless, we use them, so they're a social construct that we use. And when we put somebody into one of these categories, then, okay, through a process of socialization, we automatically associate other features with them, like propensity towards criminality and other attributes as well, okay? That would be racial profiling, okay? So where you have what's called selective enforcement, right? You're being selective about where you enforce the law, okay? Is that the case among, okay? And so we're not going to have time to get into this. It's not a class on criminology, but I can tell you that on balance, okay, the evidence and the social scientific literature supports fairly strongly the idea that there is selective enforcement, okay, weighted against these minority populations. Okay, social class I mentioned. Yeah, let me show you something now. This is kind of the centerpiece of what I wanted to talk to you about. Take those 3 categories of crime, against person, against property, actually just those, and track those over time, over the decades in the United States. What does the United States show? Okay, so let's see, this goes out to 2010. In your textbook, they'll bring it out another 5 years, and I'll bring you over to the FBI's website and show you an update, and you can see stuff at the state level as well. Here's what this shows. The red is all the crimes lumped together, all the different kinds of violent crimes lumped together. On the other, so on the left, your left are violent crimes, on the right are property crimes. The red is all the different categories, subcategories lumped together. It starts in 1960. What do you see? You see what this number is here, 150 persons out of 100,000 during that year would have been victims of these kinds of crimes: aggravated assault, robbery, rape, murder, and so forth. So it starts at that number, low number, and let me do something here. Let me show you that. Had this graph gone back further in the past to the 1950s, the 1960s, and so on, to about World War II, you would have seen a kind of serrated, jagged line, but it would have hovered around this 150. So you would have seen relatively stable rates, and those rates would have been on a par with the rates that you see in other industrialized advanced countries. Then what you see beginning in the 1960s is this big old climb. Wow. Geez, what did they put in the water, right? What happened? And then you notice it peaks. It peaks when? It peaks in the early 1990s, and it goes down. It descends again. They took that stuff out of the water, right? And what if we went further out? What would we see? Have we, right? We're now in 2020, so another decade. What's happened in this decade? And I'll show you guys. Let me bring you over to this website, the FBI, or you can pull it up yourself on your own computers. Okay, where am I? Okay, here's the FBI's, and go into their site. You just type in FBI, but this allows you to go down to crime data, Explorer, crime rates, explore by location and data set, and you're like, oh, there's us. Yep, that's Indiana. Let's check out Indiana. Here's the FBI. And the FBI, now, actually, let me get a different state. They're going to change the shape of the curve depending on a host of factors. What do we got here? We got Ohio. Now here's what you can see it. You can see it better here. So what's happened in that last decade? Okay, and we're not going to go into any explanations of these, but you can simply, ask yourself what's been going on in the last decade. But notice so actually what I want to point out, you can't see it that well in this particular state either. So 460, what you may have noticed on the last graph is that, okay, we started at like 150 per 100,000, then we went all the way up to like 700, 800 per 100,000, and then we kind of went back down, but not back down to 150, more like 400, 300 or whatever. So we got that 400 number. So 2010, about 400, it kept on going down. Now, kind of post 2010, And we might want to think 2008. What happened in 2008? There's what was called the Great Recession, but across the nation, there has been a little uptick, local rise in crime. So they're creating this little trough here. But then it looks like it's kind of in the last couple years started going back down again. So it looks like the overall trend that began in 1990 is still the case, but you can have little mini dips or troughs or rises. Okay, and you might ask whether or not, think back to strain theory. Strain theory predicts that as the economy gets better, crime goes down, economy gets worse, crime goes up, and certainly there's that Great Recession, unemployment, stresses, and so on that resulted from that. And so you might say, if you're a strain theorist or you like that theory, that, aha, yes, just as it predicted, crime started going back up again. Let's see, and you can just notice that, look, so these are updated. You can go down, here are the categories that they're interested in. You'll notice social class is not to be found there. Interesting. That seems to me like a grave omission, but there it is. So race, yes, I mean, here, and it's going to vary by state quite a bit. Here you see, so in violent offenses, Black or African Americans, I mean, they're actually account for a significantly greater proportion of violent crime arrests than the white population. Why would that be? Well, that's a good question. That's a research question. Okay, you can come up with guesses for it, but you need to put those as hypotheses to be tested. Just curious. I'm exercise my curiosity, but I'm not going to linger too long. So this is another state, Michigan. Okay, you might think in terms of like, what are the major metropolitan areas there? What ethnic groups are or are not fairly highly concentrated or of a fairly high proportion in those areas and so on, when you take a look at what you find down here. Yeah, once again, take a look at sexes. This is going to be pretty invariable. It's by large, it's going to be males by in order of 3 or more, okay, outnumbering females. Okay, so there's that data. So that's available to everyone. Okay, if you're interested in kind of a more local, state by state, I don't know if they go more fine grained than that down to the, say, county levels or not. Okay, let's see. Let me go back to PowerPoint. Yeah, so here's how I want to finish out today is, so the crime rate. You could call this a boom and bust cycle. Crime was booming. It was going way, way up. And then there was the bust, right? It fell back down again, just like boom and bust cycles in the economy or in other kinds of, all kinds of different phenomena across the natural world. What accounts for it? What's going on? And in your textbook, the pages where the bust, what accounts for what happened after 1990? Why did crime start going down? There's actually a list. I'm going to point you to the list. It's on page 273 in your textbook. And it has to do with things like changes. These are guesses. And people have actually tried to determine to what extent different factors have accounted or are responsible for the drop in crime. Okay. Better economy in the 1990s. There was economic growth, sustained economic growth throughout the 1990s, creating employment opportunities. So strain theory would have said, aha, yeah, that's why. There's what's called the incarceration boom in the United States. Okay, and I'll show you this in a little bit, but basically, similar to this long-term change in the rates of crime going way up, beginning in the early, well, the 1970s, especially the early 1980s, whereas the US used to lock up about the same number of people as, say, the UK or France or other countries we normally compare ourselves to, and that is to say about between 100 and 150 persons per 100,000. 2 decades later, and we suddenly were incarcerating about 5 times more than other countries. A massive skyrocketing of the number of people behind bars in the United States. And that remains true to this day. For about the last 5 years, there's been a little plateau and even a slight reduction, but we are still number 1 in the world in the number of people behind bars, okay? So that's a fact which has exercised the imagination and the curiosity and the explanatory, efforts of many a criminologist. Okay, so that's one factor. Is that why? Policing changes, changes in, what's happening in the drug trades and so on and so forth. Okay, so I'll leave that to you guys to read. I want to give you very quickly explanations for the boom, what accounts for why it was that it looks like there was something in the water. And so for that, I'm going to unshare and I'm going to quickly use this whiteboard thing here and list these out. Here are some of the explanations or factors that people have looked at when they've tried to account for what was going on. Okay, why did crime rise? So rise, big, and this is hard to write with, still is. Number 1 was demography. So here's one thing that happened after World War II. After World War II, there was a boom in the number of babies born. Boom in babies born, right? BBB. So the boom in babies born meant that right after World War II, the age at which you see the highest rates in the commission of crime between 15 and 24, when is that going to happen? When are those people born right after World War II going to hit their peak age of criminality? It's going to start being in the early 1960s, right? So you could say the criminal age cohort, that is the group of people, criminal age cohort, okay, hits peak age early 1960s. Okay, now it turns out when you take a look in your textbook, I think, yeah, they actually mention one of the reasons for the drop in crime may have something to do with the fact that there's actually the converse happening in the early 1990s. So your book writes a reduction in the youth population. It was noted that previously young people are responsible for much more violent crime. During the 1990s, population ages 15 to 24 dropped by 5%. Okay, so maybe some small contribution to that reduction in crime. One of the other things that was what they called a drop. People have theorized that there was a drop in what's called political legitimacy during the 1960s. I won't say too much about this, but if you know anything about the 1960s, this may seem not surprising to you. Drop in political legitimacy, what that means is the extent to which people trust and respect institutional positions of authority. Things like presidents and other elected officials, police officers, and you name it, and also even the laws of the land. And there's this one criminologist who has tried to explain long-term trends, not just in the United States, but elsewhere in criminality, according to whether the general population was happy or not with political leadership, whether they thought political leadership was honest, was fair, was moral, and so on. During the 1960s, during what's called the counterculture, there was widespread criticism, doubt towards the institutions of the United States for reasons that, from my own point of view, I think are incredibly justifiable, okay? Because there were so many bad laws. So, for example, so-called Jim Crow laws, okay, basically instituted legal segregation of races in the South. So that was a law, right? So you would be a lawbreaker if you broke those laws. And so lots of people lost lots of respect for laws of those kinds and the kind of people who would support those laws, okay? Okay, and a whole host of other kinds of kind of social turmoil or unrest around questions of the legitimacy of authority. And the idea is, to the extent that leadership and laws lose legitimacy, people are more likely to violate the laws. Family structure. Okay, so you begin to see, beginning in the early 1960s, you begin to see a rise in divorce that is fairly dramatic. So rise in divorce kind of plateaus sort of kind of around the 1980s. Okay, so 1960s, and control theory would lead you to expect that there's going to be a rise in criminal behavior for the simple reason that the control mechanisms that kind of stable conventional families exercise on the behavior, on the brains of people being socialized, are going to be loosened. Those control structures are going to be loosened, and also just there's going to be less surveillance. As you have more single parent households, I mean, you're going to cut by half the number of personnel in a household that can keep track of what their kids are doing. Right? So supervisory capacity declines. And then the economy. I'm going to there's other factors that people have pointed to. I think these are four of the biggest that people have looked at. The economy, but this was a question mark. Okay, so we're going to put a question mark there. Before the 1960s, when the economy went up and down, what you would see is crime would be inverse. So the economy got better, crime would go down. As the economy dipped, crime would go up, and so on and so forth, okay? That relationship, beginning in the 1960s, no longer held. So the United States kept becoming wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, growth every year. And in fact, growth of a kind that actually ended up being shared by people at the top and people at the bottom. We'll actually learn that in the United States, that sharing of the growth in wealth in the United States has stopped for the last several decades, okay? But then it was the case. And so people, well, then why? I mean, if economically everyone overall is getting better, why do we see this rise in crime? Okay, so people had to, if they still believed that the economic factors were playing a role, they had to sort of refine. And what they did is they turned to ideas of relative deprivation. So this says that even though, if let's say you're poor, okay, compared to other people, but if you compared how you're doing as a poor person to like, you know, how poor people were doing 10 years ago, you'd be doing just fine. Okay. No problems feeding yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But what counts is how you're doing, how you perceive how you're doing relative to people near you that you can see living close to you. Okay. And that may lead you to feel deprived, and to feel deprived in a way that doesn't feel fair, doesn't feel right. Okay. So the economy can still play a role if it interacts in an important way with how you interpret your material conditions relative to others. So that's a very short list. I'll give credit to, you don't have to know this, but the guy who compiled this list of factors, the person I got this from was a guy named Gary Lafree, studies kind of historical history of criminality in the United States. Yeah, good. So that's set of explanations. And so kind of to sum up, I mean, this doesn't tell us that we've solved the mystery. These are factors that people have put forward as tentative explanations for why we saw the kind of trend that we saw. It's still an ongoing research question, just as the drop in criminality is an ongoing research question. Let's see where we are right here. Heard of that guy. Let me go on. Let's see what we got in the next slide. Yeah, this slide, this shows the age cohort thing. You know, it's between 15 and 24. Okay, in this histogram, that's when crime spikes. This slide, I'm not going to talk about this today. But what I'll do is say that this slide, and let's see, the pages again have to be adjusted, but due process, the police, and also these questions here in the red. I'll leave that up to you guys. Say if on, it won't be on this next quiz, but perhaps on the very last quiz/exam of this semester, that last week, if I ask a question about these, it's open book basically. You can refer to this PowerPoint. If I ask a question about what are some of the factors, is racial profiling, is the race or ethnicity of the person a decisive factor in whether or not police decide to make an arrest, right? Are they doing selective enforcement? You can refer to this in the textbook. So the page is going to be like 260 something. The courts. What is the role of so-called plea bargaining? Okay, basically it's a method for dealing with numbers and for dealing with large number of people who get into the court system in as quick a manner as possible, which begs question of justice. Basically what they do is they opt for they plead guilty to a less severe penalty than they were charged with. Okay, and that gets resolves the matter really quickly. You can get done right now instead of like dragging things out and just because you want to plead innocent. So people get question the justice of the justice system on the extent to which plea bargains are used. Okay. One last question. Recidivism is a word used for reoffending. Okay. What people track recidivism rates. What are the percentage of people who, after receiving a sentence of incarceration, getting locked up as ex-convicts, how many of these people lapse back into crime and end up back behind bars again. So that's recidivism is kind of reoffending, falling back again. The rates of recidivism are very high in the United States, between 60 and 70%. And one question you could ask is, does labeling theory help us explain recidivism, right? Remember, you get a label, and the label affects your identity, affects the way people react to you. And the question is, could that labeling, receiving a permanent label, help explain why it's hard to sort of get back up and, lead a kind of spotless existence after doing your sentence? Okay. Well, I didn't go too much longer than I thought I was going to do today.